Descriptions on. So thank you all for coming to our part 2 about reclaiming the narrative, teaching guidance, lessons, and resources for talking about Native American boarding schools. This session is specifically geared for grades 3 through 5. So with that, I just want to also say that this is a great partnership between the Office of Indian Education at the Arizona Department of Education, my Academic Standards Unit, and then also the Phoenix Indian Visitor School Center and the Administration for Native Americans. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Helen.
Yes, so just like in part 1 of our series, we are going to ask when you introduce yourself to please include a quick land acknowledgement. We won't show the video that we showed in part 1, but Linda did drop the link in the chat and to that website from the U.S. Department of Arts and Culture, which has more than just that video, other great resources for talking about honoring Native land. And so we've also included the link to the nativeland.ca map, and that shows Indigenous territories, languages, and ancestral homelands. So if you need to, please take a look at that. But we will move forward in our introductions. And while we're introducing ourselves, just because you are likely already familiar with us if you watched part 1, we just ask that you introduce yourself in the chat, sharing your name, your role, the organization you're with, and again, the tribal nation closest to you or on whose ancestral homelands you're currently living or working. So I'm going to take a moment to introduce myself in my language. Petu washte, Helen wape Thomas imachape kasto, malakota kasto, chante washte nape chiazapi. So hello, good day. My name is Helen Thomas. I am the Professional Learning Coordinator for the Office of Indian Education. And I introduced myself in Lakota, which is my tribal nation. And I haven't shared this in all the other sessions, but the person who taught me to introduce myself that way was my grandmother, Helen Alkire, who was a paraprofessional, a classroom teacher, a Lakota language teacher, and a boarding school survivor. So I just wanted to acknowledge her and everything that she taught me, because it's one of the reasons why I was so motivated to partner with Linda and our wonderful community partners for this session. With that, I will turn it over to Linda to introduce herself.
Wonderful. So thank you all for coming. My name is Linda Burrows, and I am the K-12 Director for Social Studies and World and Native Languages here at the Arizona Department of Education. With that, I'd like to do our ADE land acknowledgement. So we would like to acknowledge that the Arizona Department of Education is located on the ancestral homelands of the Akimel O'odham and the Peepash peoples. We recognize that the Akimel O'odham and Peepash peoples are as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land. And then we also acknowledge that without their knowledge and contributions that we would not be able to survive on these lands as guests today. We would also like to acknowledge that Phoenix is actually home to one of the largest metropolitan urban Native communities in the entire United States. So many of your students that you may be teaching, you may not realize, have Indigenous ties to their communities.
And thank you to those that are introducing yourselves in the chat. We also want to acknowledge, although they're not in the room with us here today, our wonderful community partners from the Phoenix Indian School Visitor Center and the Administration for Native Americans, Molita Yazi, who really initiated this partnership and brought forth this idea to provide some of this professional learning for educators in our state. And then also our community partner, Manuel Pino, who is a professor in American Indian Studies for many decades and who graciously offered us quite a bit of learning in part 1 of this session. And just as a reminder, if you were unable to join us for part 1, you can watch the recording of that session. And I believe Linda sent that out in the reminder email for today. So please continue to introduce yourselves. We really appreciate that. Great to see that we have a variety of grade levels here, some 3rd, some 4th, and 5th grade teachers. With that, we are going to just remind everyone of our community agreements because just like in session 1, we will be asking you to engage with each other in small group discussions in the chat today. And so we want to ensure that we have some community agreements laid down for how we want to be in this space together. So first and foremost, that we're all here to learn. And with that agreement, we recognize that everyone's going to be at different places with this topic. Maybe you've already taught or you're familiar with some of the resources or the practices that we'll be sharing, whereas other people, this might be the first time you have the chance to have these kinds of discussions, and we're grateful for everyone who's in this space. We also want to acknowledge that we really believe that everyone brings valuable knowledge and experiences regardless of where you're at in your learning journey. And so with that agreement comes this understanding of please respect what's shared in your small group discussions. Please respect the experiences and the knowledge that each person is bringing in. And we really try to design a session where we can learn with and from each other, not just from Linda and myself. We also ask that you take care of yourself and others, including any type of social and emotional needs you might have when it comes to this very heavy topic. Please don't hesitate to take care of your needs as you see fit. And then lastly, please expect and accept non-closure. We have a limited amount of time together today, but we're really hoping to give you some tools, some language, some resources that you can use to continue your own learning and bring this learning into your classrooms with your students.
Go ahead and go to the next one, Helen.
There we go.
There we go. So for today's agenda, we've gone over our welcomes and introduction. We plan to review culturally responsive and culturally sustaining and trauma-informed teaching and what that means. We'll explore resources that you can use to teach about Native American boarding schools. Also examine how Native American boarding schools fit into our grades 3 through 5 standards, and then have some time for some closing reflections. So we've developed some learning outcomes, and we've got them listed there where we're going to, again, explore adapted trauma-informed and culturally responsive guidelines, look at and demonstrate understanding for how to use these resources, and as you're searching for them, which ones are maybe more appropriate than others. Identifying opportunities in the standards, brainstorming ideas. We want to give you, again, time as a community to come together and really work some of this out and plan some future things to do.
So with that, we are very committed here at the Arizona Department of Education to provide learning opportunities that promote culturally responsive approaches, that promote trauma-informed teaching. So we want to start off by asking where you're at in your understanding around these topics. So what do you already know about culturally responsive or trauma-informed teaching? And then also, what questions do you have regarding teaching about Native American boarding schools specifically? And this is a great point to note that if you have questions that come up throughout our session today, please put them in the chat. We will see them and then we will answer them at the appropriate time. We want to respect everybody's time though and ensure that we are moving forward through our agenda and that we're able to get through everything we have planned for today. So dropping those questions in the chat when they come up or in this Mentimeter will be very helpful. So you can use the link that Linda dropped in the chat to anonymously share some of your thoughts around what you already know about these topics and what questions you're coming into the space with. And we'll take a few minutes to reflect and then I can pull up those responses on the screen.
Oh, Helen, I noticed that Professor Pino has joined us today. So maybe we might want to take a moment and have him introduce himself.
Yes.
Sorry to put you on the spot, Manny.
Good afternoon. I apologize for being late. I am in cool Albuquerque, New Mexico, where it's 84 degrees, believe it or not. So not to rub it in, but a lot cooler than when I left Tempe yesterday at 110. No, so nice to be here. As I said, I apologize for my tardiness, and I'm very honored and pleased to be part of this very worthwhile educational undertaking around federal Indian boarding schools, and looking forward to this afternoon's session. I'm from Acoma Pueblo in New Mexico, a retired professor in American Indian Studies as well as sociology. I taught at Arizona State for like 5 years and then finished my career at Scottsdale Community College on the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian community right here in Maricopa County. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for making it here. And since it's 112 today here in the Valley, I am very, very jealous of your Albuquerque weather right now. All right. Helen, do you want to move on?
I think if we could take just another minute or so, we really want to encourage you to share where you're at in your understanding or any questions you might have. I did see someone's response around the fact that they attended our other series from this summer around integrating Indigenous perspectives. So they're bringing in some of that understanding. Someone else shared that they have had some training in the neurosequential model of education. So they have a understanding of training in trauma. No questions at this time. I think we'll take just a few more seconds. We appreciate those of you that are adding your responses. Okay, I think we're good to move forward. And again, if you have any questions that come up throughout our session today, please feel free to drop them in the chat and we will respond to them.
All right, we're going to move into our first two learning outcomes, really looking at and investigating what does culturally responsive and trauma-informed teaching mean? We hear those buzzwords kind of thrown around all over the place nowadays, especially given the difficulty and the trauma caused from COVID for our children. So we're really going to, I'm going to let Helen kind of lead most of this as we go through really informing us of what culturally sustaining and revitalizing practices are, and where the Arizona Department of Education Office of Indian Education is coming from, and what they're providing for all of us to use as guidelines going forward. So I will turn it over to her.
Thank you, Linda. So we really just want to start with how the Arizona Office of Indian Education has been defining culturally responsive education or culturally responsive teaching and learning. We get a lot of requests as the Arizona Office of Indian Education to provide guidance and resources around how to be culturally responsive when it comes to learning with our Indigenous students and communities. And so our working definition, which means that it may change in the near future, is that culturally responsive teaching and learning is informed by and or intentionally integrates cultural strengths in order to master Arizona state standards. And by cultural strengths, we mean the specific assets that students bring with them into the classroom. And these could be referred to as their funds of knowledge, their community cultural wealth, or their ways of knowing and being. Those are all kind of terms that are used in the research, in theory, around how to leverage your students' strengths and really be asset-based. But really all these are the routines, the communication styles, the information processing strategies that many of our students bring with them into the classroom because it's how they're learning in their home environment, right? And so we want to be mindful, though, as Linda said, the Arizona Office of Indian Education is actually moving towards using the language of culturally sustaining and revitalizing education, which follows in that progression of culturally relevant, culturally responsive, to now much of the research is saying culturally sustaining and revitalizing. And all this means is that we're being very intentional about both home cultural knowledge and ways of being and the mainstream cultural knowledge and ways of being that we learn in school are valued, they're maintained, they're nurtured. And so when we think about the history of boarding schools and the ways that our Indigenous students' cultural strengths were treated in the boarding schools, we have a question we'd love for you to consider and share your thoughts in the chat. Given what we learned in part 1 of this series about how cultural strengths were treated, why is it important to include that word revitalizing in addition to sustaining? And so revitalizing really is talking about bringing back, reclaiming, re-strengthening. And so we're curious to hear what connections you might make to what we talked about in the first part of this series. And so we'll take just a minute or so and respond in the chat. Why do you think many Indigenous communities are asking for culturally sustaining and revitalizing education? So thank you so much, Molly, in the chat. Molly wrote, revitalizing because home cultural knowledge and ways of being were not only ignored, but also actively discouraged and weakened in Native American boarding schools. Exactly, that really great historical overview that Professor Pino provided showed us that that these ways of being students, their cultures, their languages were intentionally disrupted, right? Not only through the boarding schools, but through a number of other policies as well. And so that's why a lot of Indigenous communities, Indigenous educators are advocating for culturally sustaining and revitalizing. Just that inclusion of that word revitalizing acknowledges that these ways of being need to be re-strengthened because of the history of federal Indian boarding schools. I also want to acknowledge someone shared that they weren't able to attend part 1, and that's okay. Part 1 was recorded, and you can go back and watch the recording. And it has really great information and context just around the history and the impact, the intergenerational impacts of boarding schools. And so we encourage you to go back to Linda's email, and I believe she included the link directly in that email, so you can always go back and watch it. Thanks for asking. Yeah, someone else shared in the chat too that people are fighting back against the negatives that happened in the Native American boarding schools. I think that's a great point. And so we want to just offer, again, a really quick starting point, a brief overview of how we can start to think about our students' cultural strengths and incorporating, integrating them, really sustaining them in our classrooms. And so one helpful way to think about it is to think about what levels of our students' cultures, of their strengths, are we incorporating in our classrooms. And so we can think of culture as a tree, right, that has multiple levels, and other trainings might refer to the 3 levels of culture as an iceberg, but I really think that the analogy of a tree is super helpful. And so the surface level, the leaves of the tree, are those observable features. These are things like food, language, tradition, like holidays, celebrations, things that are visible, right? This next level of culture is shallow, and these are the unspoken norms and protocols and things that can still be discerned through careful and intentional observation and inquiry and relationships with people within that culture, right? However, the deepest level of culture, the foundation represented by the roots of the tree, are the collective beliefs and the values that often are only identifiable by those who are active participants within that culture and may not even be considering or reflecting on those aspects until they do intentionally, right? Oh, I love, someone shared in the chat that an example of a deep level of culture is Navajo clanships, and that's exactly right. Many Indigenous communities have very long-standing and intricate, nuanced kinship systems that are specific to their communities that really get at those deep levels of culture, right? So I really appreciate that example. Thank you. And I also love that Linda put in the chat that, yeah, this analogy of a tree, I think is, it's a more positive analogy because a tree changes, right? It grows, it adapts to its environment, to the seasons that it's in. And that's really how we hope teachers are thinking about culture as well. It's not static, and there's no one Native or Indigenous culture. Each culture is unique, and even within a community, the way that culture is demonstrated is going to change. And so I learned about this analogy of a tree from Zaretta Hammond's 2015 book, culturally responsive teaching in the brain. And in that book, she talks about how historically a lot of the integrations of culture into our classrooms kind of stop at that surface level, right? And while those are really important, we want those surface level integrations as well. Neuroscience actually shows us that if we can start to integrate and tap into the really deep levels of our students of culture within our classroom, that's going to have a higher cognitive impact. And it's really going to support deeper learning and more meaningful learning and help students make sense of what we're learning in the classroom. And so with that, I want to be clear that when we are advocating for teachers to be culturally sustaining and revitalizing, we're not asking for you to be experts in your students' culture. And in fact, if you're not a member of that community, it may not be appropriate for you to necessarily know all of the cultural aspects of your students. And so in a sense, cultural humility is actually really important and necessary for us as educators to build our cultural competency. And it's helpful to acknowledge that we need to take the time to learn with and from students, families, community members, if we really wish to respectfully integrate their cultural strengths into our classrooms. But this starts with first considering our own cultural background and considering how it influences our choices in teaching and learning. But when we model this sense of cultural humility and this self-reflection, we're showing our students, right, that cultural competency is a lifelong journey, and it's going to benefit them regardless of what context they're in or who they're with, to be mindful of, to have cultural awareness, right? The Office of Indian Education specifically advocates for learning about Indigenous knowledge systems as a way to learn more about Indigenous students and Indigenous peoples' deep levels of their culture, right? Many Indigenous knowledge systems hold within them the values and the collective beliefs that we saw in that other graphic, right? And we want to be mindful that when we say Indigenous knowledge systems, we are intentionally plural because these ways of knowing and being, the ways that Native people share knowledge, the way they demonstrate knowledge, the way they transfer knowledge, right, is often place-based. It's often rooted in those long-standing relationships to certain places and in community and kinship, just like Cheryl said earlier. We can see a lot of these traits on this graphic demonstrated in traditional education approaches, where in Indigenous communities, often learning was an intergenerational activity that was hands-on, experiential, again, really grounded in the relationships that existed between relatives and community members. And again, it was dynamic and responsive. And so we hope that you consider some of these traits, some of these kind of principles across all the different resources we share today to think about how can we bring, as Linda said, Indigenous ways of knowing and being into our instruction about Native American boarding schools, because that's really going to be how we become culturally sustaining and revitalizing. All right, and so I'm going to pass it off to Linda to highlight some of the guidelines that we've shared in a few of our other professional learning opportunities.
Sure thing. So one of the major guidelines that we focus on here at the Department of Education is the National Council for the Social Studies position statements with regards to teaching responsibility. And part of this goes through 7 recommendations, which this was in our last training that Helen and I did before, and you can read all of them on the screen. They're really just 7 great ideas to keep in mind as you look forward and as you cover different types of topics dealing with Indigenous peoples. But we wanted to focus on number 5, like Helen mentioned, that idea of affirming Indigenous knowledges, that there's not just like we have students that don't have one way to learn, they all have their different learning styles. I think we need to make sure that we also affirm and focus on some of those other ways of knowing as well. And so Helen and I are trying to model some of that today for you as we do our planning, and we hope that you can take some of those ideas and knowledge systems into your classrooms as well.
Yeah, thank you, Linda. So now we want to turn our attention towards being trauma informed, our other kind of guiding approach to this topic. And we showed you this slide towards the end of part 1 of the series. And again, the intention was to highlight the fact that as teachers in the classroom, we don't necessarily need to know the specifics of the trauma that certain students are working through, but instead be mindful of the way that trauma is, as it says on the slide, omnipresent, and be mindful of the ways that it could be impacting our learning community. And so we're not really encouraging you to play, as I've heard it referred to by some people, trauma detective, and determine which of your students and families have been directly impacted by the history and the legacies of boarding schools. But instead, we asked you, right, to consider your own shared responsibility for moving forward from the impacts of boarding schools. And so the last row on the left-hand side of being trauma informed talks about how trauma, again, is omnipresent and emphasizes a shared responsibility, which is why we asked you to consider those two specific questions in part one of how does the information you learned about boarding schools impact the way you see your role as an educator, right, within this system, but then also what do you believe your responsibilities are towards Native students, families, and tribal nations, given the history of federal Indian boarding schools and our roles as educators within this system. So we just want to bring it back to that point. And Linda's dropped the link to where we got this table from in the chat. But we do want to talk a little bit more specifically about what we can do as teachers in the classroom to be trauma informed. And so one part of being trauma informed is recognizing that certain topics like federal Indian boarding schools can re-traumatize or cause harm if they're not accompanied by intentional instruction. And so as teachers, we have the opportunity to hold space, right, and provide students with the tools to make meaning from the true history of topics like Native American boarding schools. And so we're highlighting a 2021 article from Edutopia by First Nation Indigenous educator Suzanne Methot. And she offers some really wonderful considerations for when we're teaching about tough topics like colonization, like the federal Indian boarding school movement. And what she recommends is really helping students make meaning from emotions, recognize that these topics can bring up emotions in learners and be prepared for that in your planning, right? So she recommends working outward from the self in present day, similarly to how we did in part one, right? We asked you to consider your own role, your own relationship to the topic, towards backwards, towards a nuanced understandings of history. So we really hoped in part one that by asking you to reflect on your own role, you were better able to process the history of the boarding schools and make meaning from that really great information that Professor Pino shared around the history. She also recommends avoiding centering non-Indigenous people and their feelings, but really shifting towards relationships and responsibility, which again, we hope you felt you got to experience in part one when we asked you to consider your responsibilities as an educator in the public schooling system to Native peoples. Lastly, her recommendation that I think is so critical and we're hoping to emphasize throughout today's session is the importance of portraying Indigenous peoples with agency, to not position them as passive actors in this history, right, who just had things happen to them, but instead to really emphasize the agency that they showed, the survivance, the resilience that they brought throughout history and into modern times. And so with that, the article link is in the chat and we hope you read it because the author lays out some really great recommendations and some resources that you can use to kind of help you plan for using inquiry and academic discussions to process the information and the emotional reactions. And that, again, can simply look like talking circles like we did in part one, where we just gave you the space, we planned the time for you to have a discussion together and to use inquiry to respond to those really intentional prompts. So we hope that you have an idea of how maybe you could bring, again, an Indigenous way of communicating, which is talking circles, into the way that you teach this topic.
So another option that we wanted to share with you were some trauma-informed guidelines from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And while this doesn't deal with Native American boarding schools, there are some good guidelines to keep in mind as you go forward when you are dealing with difficult topics like the Native American boarding schools, but not just including the Holocaust or Native American boarding schools. The first one that I think is really important is the idea of defining terms. Vocabulary matters. Helen had mentioned that before. The language that you choose matters. And just making sure that you are selecting and that your students are using terminology where everybody's on the same page. And that's really what that means. Avoiding simple answers to complex questions is another one where there may not be a completely fulfilling answer to a problem. Striving for a precise language that kind of goes along with the vocabulary. Balance in establishing whose perspective informs your study of whatever it is. So when you're studying about Native American boarding schools or any difficult topic, you want to make sure that you are promoting narratives from people who lived through it, and also a perfect example of this is The Boy in the Striped Pajamas. A lot of schools love reading that book on the Holocaust, but it's actually a book that's told from the point of view of a German boy. And it really, while it's great that you're reading and you're informing your kids about the Holocaust, it's not really the true narrative of what happened. And I think a lot of kids get that misperception. So that's where you just want to make sure that you choose that. You also want to avoid comparisons of pain, right? One traumatic event is not necessarily one to compare to another traumatic event, but what you can do is look for ways in which you can make connections to the idea of what might be some similar characteristics or similar events that happened. And again, using those authentic resources with narratives by the people who actually experienced them is going to be that key. Avoid romanticizing history and contextualizing history. That's always important, to put things in the bigger picture, right? What else is going on and what is causing this? This isn't happening in a vacuum. And then also just making sure that you're making responsible choices with your research, with your resource selection, looking at how it's relating to the standards, being respectful of victims and survivors, because again, we know this trauma gets passed down intergenerationally, and just making sure that you're doing effective learning. You can show a perfect example from the Holocaust is you can show pictures of the horrific scenes from the Holocaust, but that's not necessarily the best choice to do, right? You don't necessarily want to show those horrific images of, the bodies in graves, right? You can get across the horrors of what happened with this. And Helen's right. Go back and watch part 1, because Professor Pino did a wonderful job of putting this in the larger context of US history for us.
Thank you, Linda. And I think your point around the importance of being mindful around images is important, because again, we do not want to re-traumatize students. And so another helpful guideline that I've heard online is the giving, those trigger warnings, those content warnings that you will be showing something that could be upsetting. And of course, letting your students know that, especially your Indigenous students, if they do need to step away, giving them that space to step away and kind of emotionally regulate if needed.
Okay. Can I just interject something here really quick? Secretary of Interior Haaland, in her ongoing initiative in addressing the trauma of federal Indian boarding schools, has just begun the testimonials that were just presented over this week in Oklahoma. And there are some sites that have recorded both audio and on video in some of the testimonials. I think that would be an invaluable resource at this point, to listen directly, to some of the, as was mentioned in the last 2 slides, the relational interconnectedness between living that experience and the correlation with intergenerational and historical trauma. Especially in the testimonials from the elders, some of the elders who presented testimony, who are now in their 70s and 80s. And it just shows how much of that experience was retained in these testimonials. That was a long time ago for some of the reflections in the testimonies that were presented to correlate with the excellent suggestions that are being brought forth in this presentation by Helen and Linda. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I know we will dig deeper to try and find some of those links so we can include them in our resource collection. But if you know of any particularly good ones, please feel free to share them. Oh, and thank you, Mr. Ruiz, for sharing in the chat an article, it looks like, of tribal elders recalling some of those memories. We will be sure to add that to our resource collection. It's really nice. We have one link for you that has all the resources, and we can update that as needed, and you will see everything that we've added. So we do want to give you all a chance before we go into a break to process some of this information, again, to make meaning from it and to build relationships with each other. And so we are going to send you into some small groups for just a few minutes, probably just around 6 or 7 minutes. And we're asking for you just to start to consider, based on what we just shared on being culturally sustaining and revitalizing or trauma informed, what would an approach using those lenses to teaching specifically about boarding schools look like? What are some ideas, some connections you're starting to make? Or if you're thinking through coming at it from a different perspective, what might be some challenges, right, of bringing this type of approach to this particular topic? We are going to ask again that you follow a talking circle protocol. Please allow each person in your group to introduce themselves. You can just quickly share your name and your role if you'd like, and then just share in a few sentences your thoughts, your response to these prompts. And then you can either kind of popcorn style pass it along to someone else, or just step back and then make space for someone else to respond. But we really ask that you allow each person the time to share their thoughts before you have further discussions or start building on, because we want these spaces to be equitable and inclusive. So Linda's dropped the questions in the chat. I think we'll take about 6 minutes and allow you all to introduce yourselves, build relationships, and start to think about our content today.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and open the rooms and pause the real quick.
So thank you so much for taking the time to discuss with others, to build those relationships. I was just telling Linda, it's really great to go into those rooms just to make sure everybody has what they need and hear really meaningful reflections happening. And I also just always love how diverse the conversations are, right? Some people were talking about the need as educators for us to build our own background knowledge, to be really mindful about making sure we have a good understanding of the topic before we bring this into our classrooms. Others were talking about just being trauma informed, almost as a school-wide approach. Like, what does that look like? Someone had a great reflection on how within schools that serve Indigenous students, right? Sometimes that recognizing, being trauma informed can just be recognizing some of the intergenerational distrust in schools and thinking about how do we repair those relationships, which I think was a great point. And so I just want to thank you all for taking the time to do that. You will have a chance to go back to those same groups to discuss at the end of our session some of your next steps for how you're going to plan for this topic. But we do want to give you a quick break. I think we'll take just about 3 minutes. And so it's 1:47. We'll come back at 1:50. Do you want to? Perfect. Thank you. So welcome back. Thank you for taking that break. We are going to transition now, which we just received a couple questions about this, into really looking at resources that you can use, approaches, tools that you can use to start teaching and learning about Native American boarding schools. And so to kick us off, I want to pass it over to Linda to speak to something that we think applies to all of these resources, and we hope you see it as a through line throughout the rest of the session.
So one of the things we wanted to touch upon is this idea of media literacy, or really anymore, we should just call it information literacy. So it's this idea that we want to teach our students to be knowledgeable consumers and producers of all of the content that they look at, watch, and especially for grades 3 through 5, as you may have some students that are already pretty adept at getting online or consuming videos and things like that. And then you may have some students that haven't even seen any, or very little online content, but just everything that we go through, we want our kids to look at these resources and think both as consumers and as producers. So thinking who created the message, what kind of techniques were used to attract their attention, how might different people understand this message in different ways. And then what values and lifestyles and points of views are really being perpetuated by these messages. Same thing with producers, right? Anytime the students pass along information or share information with either other students or with their parents, right? They need to think of themselves as producing content, right? What are they authoring? What's the message that they are getting across? Are they trying to be clear and consistent? Have they communicated effectively? And it really boils down to this idea of start to teach our kids to read laterally rather than reading vertically up and down, where you start to read and you go to the bottom, which is really antithetical to reading as a whole. But when we talk about anything online, we want our kids to always be looking and finding out, what do other people say about it, and getting those kinds of ideas. And I know that's a little bit more difficult for 3 through 5, that you're not really engaging with our kids online, but it is that idea of starting to get that practice of asking, who's creating this message? Where does it come from? And that's what we look at. There is more information. This will be hyperlinked in the PDF that you get that talks about the practice of reading laterally, not literally.
Thank you, Linda. And I think a great point is that it's really expanding, right, this idea of literacy beyond just reading and writing to a concept that I know I hear a lot of Indigenous educators referencing as reading the world, right? Reading all the sources of information and the various ways that information is shared with us, which I think we're going to show you in just a moment, all the various ways that you can present information about the federal Indian boarding schools. And so we'd like to start with the first type of resource being maps, right? And we want to include maps for their ability to connect to place. As I mentioned earlier, within Indigenous knowledge systems, Indigenous peoples have long-standing relationships to place, and not only the physical place, right, but the non-human beings that they share those places with. So animals and plants and land and waterways. And so bringing in maps as a primary source is a great way to contextualize your instruction, right, with this idea of place, and really gets at some more Indigenous pedagogy and ways you can bring in Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And then, of course, we want to highlight maps for their ability to make connections that Professor Pino made very clearly for us in part 1 between child removal policies like the Federal Indian Boarding School and the ultimate goal of land dispossession, right? And so we want to showcase maps as a way to really demonstrate that connection. And then we also encourage you again to just prioritize your local context and help students understand why this topic is relevant to them and maybe how it has affected the communities near you before zooming out and thinking about how federal Indian boarding schools happen not only on a national scale, but globally to Indigenous peoples in other countries as well. And so with that, Linda's going to take us now through an activity to model and kind of experience how we can use maps.
Thank you. So the first activity that we're going to use is something that comes from the Library of Congress, and it's called Observe, Reflect, Question. And it is a phenomenal way to get primary sources into the classroom, regardless of the grade level. So this can be used for any kind of content area, and we'll show you some examples and take you through some of the resources at the end. But I'm going to have you, as my students today, actually do this. So the first step in Observe, Reflect, Question is just this. So we have actually a map. It's a primary source that is from the recent Reclaiming the Narrative, not Reclaiming the Narrative, the Truth and Healing Coalition that just did part 1 of the Native American Boarding School report for the federal government. So this comes from Deb Haaland's office as Secretary of the Interior. So with this activity, I have this map on, it's a map of the United States, but I want you to just, and we're going to do this in the chat to make it easy. I just want you to type, what do you see? So it's not any kind of analysis. And if you want to pretend that you are a 3rd grader, 4th grader, or 5th grader, please do that. But what do you see when you look at this map on the picture? And just type your answer in the chat for me. Perfect. Lots of dots on a map. Clustered sites in the Southwest and Midwest. Places. 2 big clusters. Yep. Map of the states. 2. Almost no state is untouched. Interesting. Good comment. All right, dots throughout the map of the United States. Dots are uneven. Wonderful, excellent. So that's what the activity that you want to do. Now you can also, what's nice about these Library of Congress activities is they also have kind of prompts that you can use as the educator to maybe get some more out of the students. So you might ask things like, what do you notice first? Or what size and shape is the map? What geographical elements do you see? Is there anything on the map that looks strange or unfamiliar? Describe anything that looks like it doesn't belong is another great question. What place or places does this show on the map? And then also, because it is part of literacy reading too, we want to ask, what words do you see? Words, and what does that mean, right? So that's the whole first part of the observe portion. Now we're going to move next into reflect. So now that you've had your students really look at that and just, what is this picture? Now we want them to kind of reflect. So reflect for a moment on what you see with this map, that we know we've got a couple of clusters here. We know they're federal Indian boarding schools. Like, what do you think was, why do you think this map was made? Could be a good question that you ask your students. Or who do you think was the audience for this map? Again, teaching your students to be good consumers and producers of any kind of information. How does this map compare to current maps of the United States? What does this map tell you about the people who made it? Right? So what's the message that the federal government is trying to get across with this map? So these are all sorts of questions that you can ask your students to kind of prompt them to reflect a little bit further. And you want to make sure that, again, you give them time to do this, right? You want your students to have that time to reflect. This is a great activity to do with kids in multiple groups. You can put high and low reading abilities together, students with IEPs. Any kind of visual primary source works really, really well. And so it's just this idea of getting your students to reflect on what's going on with this map or this information, and what's the message that's trying to be conveyed here.
Yeah,
and so I think that's a good question. Helen, you had something to add?
Oh, I just wanted to say, I thought the questions you shared really connected well to the media literacy, because the one question around why do you think this map was made kind of is taking on that producer perspective, right? Like, you're asking your students to take on the perspective of whoever made this and ask why. Who do you think it was made for, and why would you make it? And so I really appreciate those prompts, because I think they help make those connections.
Another good thing too, and again, this is also, obviously this map is current, it just came out, was it this year or last year? So it's relatively new. But one nice thing to do, and again, this kind of gets to that idea of teaching and incorporating Indigenous voices, not from solely the position of victimhood or from that position of pre-1900, but if you had an old map, right, ask your kids to reflect in how would the map look different were it made today? Or if you have an old image, right, how would that image look today? And again, making it relevant to them, bringing Indigenous peoples into today, right? And I think that would be a really good way. If you had something that was more historic, it's just hard, doesn't really apply to this since it's only, 6 months to a year old. And then the last piece of observe, reflect, and question is the question part. And this is where we really want to ask our students, what do you wonder about? So who are these dots, right? What are they what are they for, right? Why are there some dots that are more in the center as opposed to the outsides? Why do you see no dots, very few dots on the East Coast, right? These are all great questions that we want our kids to ask. Why, how, really getting deep into that inquiry, letting them do the job of historians or geographers or economists or whatever it is you're studying, right? And again, this can be applied to anything, whether it's science or ELA, but taking that kind of primary source and doing observe, reflect, and question is a really great way to have your students do the work and have them really inquire as to what's going on with this image or with this resource.
Yeah, and I think there's lots of ways that having these questions, having students ask the questions of what they see on the map can lead to really meaningful learning about the history of federal Indian boarding schools, understand and why. Again, going back to part one, Professor Pino talked about, the history of relocation and how understanding that history of relocation helps us understand why most of these dots are located on the western side of the map, right? On the western side of the Mississippi. And so if we're not providing that historical context, it can be difficult for us to really answer authentically those questions that we know students will come up with because they're super critical thinkers.
Another thing to add too, when you're talking about this, especially because fourth grade includes the history of the Americas. So you'll also want to go to Canada's website and look at their commission that's come up with a lot of resources from Canadian boarding schools. So this wasn't just a North American phenomenon. It happened here in the United States. It also happened in Australia and other places where you had colonization and large indigenous populations as well. And it all began in the 1800s. And you can go back and look at that, context that Professor Pino gave us.
So another activity, and we wanted to highlight the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative report that, as Linda shared, was published just a few months ago in May. And the fact that they include maps of not only the entirety of the United States, but specific states as well, zooming in. And so this is a way for you to center local context. And so one activity that we would love to highlight, I think because we have some people on phones today, I'm not going to ask that we do the Zoom annotation because I know it can be difficult on a phone, but you could have students, you could print this off. Linda suggested yesterday in our session, you could laminate this map or put it in a sheet protector and have students mark where you are at, and then think about where you're at in relation to some of those federal Indian boarding school sites. And you can see here that there were 48 in Arizona, which I believe was second only to Oklahoma. And so there's a lot of opportunities here to connect your relationship to place with students by using the more local maps as well. We also want to, again, get to that point of how you can use maps to highlight the connection between child removal and land dispossession. And so these maps here show sort of the changing context of place over time. And this graphic on the left-hand side that says Indian Land Cessions actually comes from one of the curricula that we'll be highlighting later that does a great job of making those explicit connections. But I also love using the GIF because it is able to show that change over time. And sometimes students just really resonate with seeing that dramatic change of Indian lands being so reduced, and then having the time up in the corner again helps them connect to some of those chronological sequencing that is within our standards as well. And so we want to move forward into the next type of resource that we want to encourage you to use.
Yeah, so with books and articles, as Helen mentioned earlier, right, Indigenous communities, a big part of Indigenous ways of knowing and being includes storytelling. And so using books as a way that, oral traditions can get written down finally, or using storytelling through books is also a great way to use in our classrooms. Also, as you're choosing books, right, using stories to actually humanize that's what I kind of mentioned before, where you don't necessarily need to show so much graphic, traumatic kind of images, that you can get the horrors and the difficulties of what happened with personal narratives. And especially because in third grade, you're covering Arizona history, so you're covering Indigenous peoples. this also goes for fourth grade when you're covering about, slaves being forced to come to the Americas, and fifth grade as well. So as you're going through this, using those kinds of human stories are really big. And then centering Indigenous voices and experiences, where you're finding books that are written by Indigenous peoples, giving their perspective and their point of view. And again, that's something to kind of be cognizant of. Like I mentioned, the Boy in Striped Pajamas is a perfect example of a really popular book, but it's not really the narrative that is best used to tell the story of the Holocaust, right? So it'd be better to find something written by a survivor. So now we're going to go into some of the actual books that we recommend and that you can find.
Yeah, so all these books here on the screen are written by Indigenous peoples. They've been recommended by organizations like the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, or the blog American Indians in Children's Literature, which is run by Dr. Debbie Reese. And so we were very intentional about choosing books that do take on that perspective and center Indigenous voices. And so all of these are appropriate for your students in third through fifth grade. Some of them are geared more towards younger students, which may be appropriate for some of your students that aren't necessarily on grade level, or just, even when I taught third grade, including read alouds is a great way to honor oral traditions, and it's a way for students to access the content, right, and access the story regardless of where they're at in their reading abilities at the time. And so a lot of these stories prioritize the relationships between young people, right, and either elders or community members who have attended boarding school, like the book We Are Not Alone, but others really show the story from the perspective of a student that has gone to boarding school, like I Am Not a Number, or As Long as the Rivers Flow. Again, allow students to kind of take on that perspective of what it was like to leave your family, to leave your community, and to have this whole new way of being kind of forced upon you when you don't even speak English most often, right? And so these are all really great ways to incorporate and humanize the history of Native American boarding schools. And Linda's dropped in the chat some book lists, and there's even more on our resource collection as well, where you can get a good idea and ensure that you're choosing the right book for your students, right, based on their developmental level and also even some of their social and emotional needs, right? Oh, and thank you for someone who shared that on EPIC, which is, a resource, a digital library that educators can sign up for. And I know some LEAs have subscriptions to, and notice that the book Not My Girl is on there. There's also a lot of other great books. One thing I suggest to educators to kind of bring in the idea of agency and a strengths-based approach is ensuring that this story is not the only story you're sharing about Native peoples, right? And it's really important to bring this into a contemporary context, to read books that showcase Native peoples today and how they're revitalizing, they're reclaiming their languages, and how a lot of them continued with cultural practices despite the federal Indian boarding schools. And I know that EPIC has great books like We Are Thankful or We Are Still Here, which is an amazing way to actually bring in some of that context of federal Indian policy and contemporary experiences. So thank you so much for sharing that they're on there. So now we're going to move into talking about primary sources.
Yeah, so like we showed you, maps and books are not necessarily the only sources that you can use to teach about Native American boarding schools. We do, again, like Helen mentioned, ask that we encourage that you select sources with care and thoughtfulness. Government sites are a good place to start because all of this was documented, and you can very easily feel free to edit whatever you need to down to make it grade appropriate. So the National Archives, Library of Congress, the National Museum of the American Indian is a phenomenal resource. And if you ever get to DC, I highly recommend it. It's one of my favorite museums on the mall. Tribal Nations. So the Office of Indian Education has taken the time to collate all 22 Indigenous tribes and their contact information, and they have a resource that we've now put on the ADE website for you. State museums, so like the Capitol Museum and many others throughout Arizona, have great resources to look at, as well as the Digital Arizona Library. And it's this idea of using a, kind of systemic approach to this, right? The primary sources allow you to look at, the bigger picture, like what Professor Pino did, and that effort that was grounded in federal policy, bringing that into the context, which really fits so well, especially in, say, 4th and 5th grade history, right? Is that bigger picture of what's going on in US history and throughout the Americas, as well as you're teaching about this topic.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Linda, because we are advocating not for you to have to create a whole new unit on boarding schools, but instead think about where does it make sense to bring in this history into the American history you're already teaching, right? And so we do want to, of course, provide you with places that have primary source sets specific to Native American boarding schools. So the Library of Congress has Native American boarding schools, primary source sets. So does the Digital Public Library of America and the National Archives. But you can also go to kind of smaller organizations like the Carlisle Indian School Digital Resource Center that not only has images and records, but also has student records, lists, and ledgers from the schools, which can be just a kind of different and interesting way to think about the history of boarding schools by looking at what types of things were being recorded, why, again, bringing in that media literacy, why would they be recording this? Why would they have a list of these resources? And so these are some great sites. These are all hyperlinked in the PDF of the slides. You will be able to just click on them, or you can go to our resource collection where these will all be located as well.
So now we wanted to show you some primary source analysis tools. And we've got some great things in the chat to show you. So these are all kind of hyperlinks. So first I want to show you the Library of Congress. And so if you want to, Helen's gonna be my lovely assistant as I'm kind of walking you through these. So this is the Library of Congress primary source analysis tools. And you can see we did the observe, reflect, and question activity. But as Helen scrolls down, you can see any primary source that you use, they have guidelines for you already done. So whether it's a map, whether it's a newspaper, whether it's an oral history, right? Perpetuating some of those indigenous ways of knowing and being, right? Photographs and prints, political cartoons, sound recordings, they have everything there for you. And you just click on that, it opens a PDF. You can, I love this, honestly. This is my go-to subplan for if I have to be gone, because it's fantastic because you can have a sub walk through the primary source with your kids and it's all right there for them. And it tells them, how to prompt your students to observe, reflect, and then question and how to go forward. And so that is a great resource for you. The next one I want to go to is the National Archives, which has the same activities as the Library of Congress, but I like it a little bit better for a couple of different reasons. One, it breaks out their guides into emerging readers and intermediate readers. And so you can differentiate your instruction and give your kids the exact same worksheet. Like say if you're doing a photograph, they have one for maybe students that are not reading on level, or if you have students that are advanced, you can give them the more advanced one. So I love that. And I used that in my classroom. So you can see it's the same idea, right? Meet the photo is the observe. And then the observe its parts is kind of the reflect what's going on, and then trying to make sense of it is that question going forward. And you can see it's definitely geared towards a younger age. And then you can see the higher reading level, it's the same idea, observe, reflect, and question, but it is done at a definitely a higher reading level and higher ability. So this I like better. The other thing that I really like about these, oops, if you can just go back real quick, is that they come in Spanish. And so the fact that all of them are in Spanish is great for your English language learners, or maybe you teach in a dual enrollment classroom, but everything's in Spanish, which why not? If your student, if Spanish is their heritage language, give them the worksheets in Spanish. Who cares? They're getting the concepts. So that's one advantage to those. And then the last thing that Helen's going to show you is, this is my new favorite way to include inquiry into your lessons, is Harvard's Graduate School of Education has this Project Zero's Thinking Routine Toolbox. And as you scroll through here, this is a great way to get your kids doing work as historians, geographers, but also it works great for ELA. This works great for science. I've done this with multiple grade levels, and you can click, and as you just kind of scroll down just to show them the wealth of what they've got, all these great deeper ways. And there's one here I wanted to show you. Oh, go up just a little bit for me. Parts, perspectives, and me. So I did this for a training with Flagstaff, and I showed them a picture of a beaver dam up in Flagstaff. And then it's this idea of what are the parts in the picture, but what are the perspectives? And so I'm like, what is the perspective of the beaver building this dam? What's the perspective of the eagle flying by in this picture? What's the perspective of the trees? And again, that's kind of affirming some of those indigenous ways of knowing and being, but it's getting kids to think and inquire outside of the box too, and not in just that traditional narrative. And it's great because it shows you everything that you can do that. And we're actually going to take you through an activity where we're going to now do the circle of viewpoints from the thinking routine. So I have this, Helen found this fantastic primary resource from the Carlisle Indian School. And so we're going to do this together. So I'm going to have you answer this in the chat. So the first thing, number one, is I just want you to look at this image and brainstorm the different perspectives that you may see in this image. So go ahead and type those into the chat for me. Just a list of the different perspectives that you may see.
Linda and I are both former teachers, so we can give wait time and we're comfortable with that. And just to read off the description that is off at the bottom, I know it's kind of small. The title of this image is Educating the Indians. A female pupil of the government school at Carlisle visits her home at Pine Ridge Agency. And it's from a sketch by a corresponding artist. So if that helps you consider what are the perspectives that could be in this, whose perspectives might be here.
Oh, I like that you put the artist, right? So the person creating the picture. And again, that gets to those kind of information or media literacy skills, right? So someone illustrated this, whoever Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper is, right? But you have the perspective of the children, you have the perspective of the adults, you have the, I like that insider versus outsider kind of way that they're trying to portray this. All these different perspectives, right? And so the next step that you would with your students is have them choose one of the perspectives to explore and have them do that using these following sentence starters. So you would have them pick a perspective and say, I'm thinking of, whatever topic, visiting my family from the viewpoint of the woman with the umbrella, right? The student coming home with the umbrella, or the teacher, if she's a teacher, right? Whatever it may be. And then you also, another example would be, I think, and again, you're having the kids think as that topic, right? As that viewpoint. So if this is the teacher, if she truly is the teacher coming in to teach those Indigenous peoples, right? What is she thinking, right? What is the child thinking that's reaching up to touch her elbow? What's the other little kid thinking that's, grabbing at her purse? What are the, the men in the picture thinking versus the women in the picture? So there are all these different perspectives, and you want them to kind of be an actor and take on that character and that viewpoint. And then lastly, you have them kind of create a question. So if I were the teacher, right, what is one question that I would have going forward from this viewpoint? Or if I were the child, what would a question be? If I'm the creator of this newspaper, what is one question that I have with regards to this? Again, kind of keeping in mind that you don't want to perpetuate negative stereotypes. So, keep that as you're kind of going through, as you're coaching your students to do these kinds of things. But the idea of this is really, the purpose is creating that kind of thinking of our students, of thinking of others. It helps them to see and explore those multiple perspectives. It also helps them to understand different people, and that different people can have different points of view about the same event. So the woman might have a different point of view than the man in the picture or than the children in the picture. And that's perfect, right? That's good. We want our students to think of these. And
May
then,
I, may I make a comment?
yeah,
Yeah, I think it's really important to understand that some of these kids, not all of them, may have in their own demographic a relative that has been in a boarding school, that has possibly lost somebody at a boarding school. And they may be looking at this woman as, can you tell us where our children are?
mhm,
They may have a victim mentality. So I think it's important that she not be seen as a hero.
mhm.
I think she needs to be seen as, both sides of the fence, because there certainly is a lot of pain when you're talking about older pictures like this, and you're talking to natives about a boarding school, because they have, they'll have their own demographic. They'll have a grandma, they'll have a grandpa, that's been through abuse. So I think if we're going to do something like this, wherein I think this is a thought-provoking picture, just be cautious of the picture.
And I think,
Absolutely. I think that's the idea, that getting into who is the consumer and producer of this, like this was made for a particular purpose, right? It's made to for that reason, and we do want to be mindful of that. Helen?
yeah, and I think part of what you just shared is the importance of, as the educator in the space, doing your due diligence and making sure you understand where the image is coming from so that you are able to provide context to the students. So for example, if we look at the caption here, this is not a teacher, right? This is a student who went off to school, who's now returning back to her home community. And so I think that's really important, that you are framing the image, right, with some information, because then that could lead to misunderstandings or like bias, right? And we do want to acknowledge that for an example, like the little kids might be looking at this person who's from their community, who's coming back and saying like, why do you look different? Why are you dressed differently than us, even though you're from our community? And that's why giving some of that framing, I think, is really, really critical. And we appreciate that point. And we have tried to, offer that. That's why it's important to give students space to even consider, like, not just the facts that these people might be saying, right, but the emotions that might be perceived, or these perspectives might have. Like if this is your niece or your sister or your cousin, it might make you sad to see that she looks so different. Or knowing what we know about languages, right, it might make you sad if this student coming back no longer understands your native language and you can't communicate with them. And so as the teacher, I think it's really critical that we are being mindful, like you said, about what emotions might come up from this, recognizing what our students' backgrounds are, doing that due diligence to understand, am I teaching in a community that has been impacted by federal Indian boarding schools? And so do I have to be aware of what responses might come up? So this is clearly a very thought-provoking activity, and we appreciate you engaging in it. And for the sake of time, we do want to highlight one other way that two other ways you can use primary sources in your classroom.
Yeah, no, thank you, because I was getting off topic thinking it was the teacher, and that's a perfect example, right, of understanding the context and showing what the source is, right? So another example that we want to show with you and share with you are quotes. And so this is a great way that you can share quotes and use quotes to tell a story. You can say these quotes orally, continuing some of those oral traditions. And this is another idea that you can have your kids examine the quotes. What's going on in this quote? What story does it tell? What kind of questions do you have? Who are the people? Again, getting our kids to understand who are these consumers and producers of these quotes. So who, where did the problem of Indian administration come from? Where does that, Miriam Lewis, all of that, right? Looking at Luther Standing Bearer, who was that? How does that give you a different perspective? So again, looking at the sourcing of the quote is just as important going forward too, but another great source to use.
And then we want to end this section on primary sources, again, bringing it back to this federal investigative report that was published in May of this year. And we showed you the maps. Professor Pino referenced the actual narrative aspect of the report in part 1, but we also want to highlight in the appendix that there are briefs on all 408 identified federal Indian boarding schools. So this would be a great way, once you identify what boarding school maybe is nearest to you, closest to you, where you can get a little bit more information about that school, including possible other names, the address, the start date that it was opened, the date that it was closed. You can see here that this particular example from Wide Ruins Boarding School, the end date says open because this school is still operating. It also has how it's currently operating, which is why I chose this example specifically, because if you'll notice here, I know it's quite small. It says currently operating tribally controlled Bureau of Indian Education school. And so this is a great way to bring in that contemporary context to acknowledge that not a lot, but some federal Indian boarding schools continue to operate, but they are now tribally controlled. And so this is a way to, again, showcase agency of not just individual Native people, but tribal nations and how they're exercising their educational sovereignty, their rights to self-government, to now have a stronger influence on the education of their citizens and ensure that they are providing culturally responsive education. And so we encourage you to check out the appendix to this report that includes all of these briefs. And they even have general notes and the types of schools that they are. And so that's a great way to dig deeper into your local context as well.
Another type of source is using videos and podcasts. And so these are great in, again, continuing to promote that media literacy that we want to teach our students. It's also additionally a way that we can use these resources, again, to incorporate oral traditions into our instruction. And lastly, using videos and podcasts made by or with Native peoples is a great way to bring in additional Indigenous voices into your lessons.
Yeah, in our other series, we really advocate for partnering with community experts and community members when you're talking about Indigenous perspectives. And that can look like partnering with the tribal education department specifically as experts who may be able to help you. But we know that that's not always feasible, right? That's not always possible in all instances to bring in Indigenous peoples into every single lesson. And we want you to incorporate Indigenous perspectives as much as possible. And so using videos is a great way. And it actually reminds me of what was just shared earlier with the elder interviews, testimonials of their experiences. That's a great way to bring in diverse and additional Native voices and perspectives without having to actually ask a community member to come into your classroom if that's not possible for you at the time, although we do encourage that type of collaboration. So in addition to those elder interviews, which I think we will definitely add to our slides and add to our resource collection, we want to highlight a resource that's appropriate for younger students, right? And so I've used this with third grade students before, and it's the PBS show Molly of Denali. And so if you're not familiar, this is a PBS show that's geared for younger kids, but it's set in a rural Alaska Native village. It's the first children's show that I've seen that has an Alaska Native main character. And the show, what's really exciting about it is that it was created, and it's specifically the episodes are written to have Molly and her friends, the characters, model how children can access and create informational texts in their daily lives. But at the same time, the show includes stories that are infused with Alaska Native values, history, traditions, language, as well as contemporary life. My students and I would watch this during breakfast last summer when I was teaching summer school. And I actually had them, we pulled out the list of Alaska Native values every day. And after watching the show, reflected on where did you see Molly or her family or the community members demonstrating some of those values, and what does it look like to bring those values into their life, which again was getting at that deep level of culture, right, in a really accessible way that students enjoyed. But this particular episode is called Grandpa's Drum, and it touches on the topic of boarding schools in a way that really honors kind of the humanizing aspect of this story, but it allows students to access it through, again, the perspective of a young child whose family member, whose relative attended the boarding schools. And my favorite part of it is that the story ends on a really positive note, where through relationship building, through kinship, Molly's grandfather is able to reclaim and revitalize his drumming and his singing that he hadn't done since he was in the boarding schools. And it's just such a powerful, really just, you could even just show the second half of the episode, 10 minutes of the clip, and it would be really meaningful. The show, the resource also includes other resources for teachers specifically, right? So teaching tips, a family viewing guide, and then additional handouts for your students. So we encourage you to check out that resource because it's a great way to bring this story through a strengths-based approach.
So lastly, we recognize that, as classroom teachers, you guys have a lot on your plate. And we also want to ensure that, you're highlighting that we are highlighting ready to use lessons and easy things that we can have you really just insert into what you already have in your classrooms. And so again, we encourage you to prioritize resources that are created by Indigenous peoples and Indigenous organizations. Definitely take the time to review those lessons and resources ahead of time, right? So if your kids are going to kind of take it where they think that woman was a teacher, like I started doing, right? Bring it back to where it's a student and make sure that you focus on that. And again, we know and recognize that your students best and what they are capable of and what would be appropriate or not appropriate given the community that you teach in, and your students themselves and some of the history and trauma maybe that they have or have not experienced in their classrooms. So this lesson is also, again, from South Dakota Public Broadcasting, which is also a great, PBS has lots of great ready-to-make resources for you. And this is a resource that talks about Native American boarding schools. It has some starters that you can use going through there. The discussion questions that are included in the resource encourage students to relate to students who maybe experienced boarding schools or family members that may experience boarding schools. It also asks students to help make kind of those connections, some of those connections to the traditions and cultures of their own lives, where they can make some of those comparisons as well. Other resources that go along with this lesson include activities on land stewardship, right, which is another great way to bring in some of those balanced approaches and strength-based approaches to teaching this topic to the students. And again, that idea of Indigenous peoples having more of a say over the lands in which they have historically and currently reside on as well.
So the next lesson plan we want to highlight, I just really encourage everyone to take a look at this one because I think it's so unique. And it comes out of the Dannett Institute for Navajo Nation Educators, which is located at NAU. That's a professional learning institute. And through that institute, all of their participating teachers always create curriculum units that they then upload online, free open access to everybody. And so we're always trying to highlight these as they are often really rooted in our Arizona context. So this lesson actually explores the old Loop boarding school and makes connections between how that was once a boarding school and then later became a Japanese American isolation camp. And so using this through line of place, right, that this one place has these multiple histories and multiple perspectives, this lesson plan encourages students to see those connections and to make those comparisons across time and history. And so I just love the narrative aspect of these lesson plans, and they provide a lot of context. So it says here, by bringing the history of these two groups together, the understanding of local and national history becomes much clearer and provides a multicultural aspect of presentation that sometimes is missing from school textbooks. So again, we encourage you to take a look at this lesson, and it's a way to bring in multiple perspectives and it's just a new lens on this idea of boarding schools that you could then jump off of to talk about other marginalized histories, right, that aren't always included in our resources. And so we encourage you to check that out. And they have, again, like I said, dozens of other lessons that are appropriate. This one is for 4th grade specifically, but as Linda said, you can always adjust up or down to make it fit the needs of your students. And then, of course, we want to highlight this entire curriculum, the Truth and Healing curriculum from the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, which is a national organization that was founded to promote truth and healing around Native American boarding schools specifically. And so this asset-based curriculum comes in versions for elementary, middle, and high school students. So there is an appropriate version for grades 3 through 5. And it has 4 main lessons within the curriculum, focusing on history, impacts, stories, and healing. And I just really love that they bring in these lessons specifically focused on healing, which connects again to that revitalizing and how Native communities are reclaiming their cultures and their languages. And so each lesson includes an into, a through, and beyond sequence that really centers inquiry-based learning and encourages students to deepen their learning by making connections through extension activities. And we want to highlight, someone asked earlier, made the point that a lot of these terms are going to need to be defined for their students. And that's one of our favorite parts about this resource, is that they have definitions for a variety of different lesson plans. And I appreciate Linda highlighting a resource from Colorado that's about boarding schools for 4th graders. Other states like Oregon and Washington also have resources on boarding schools, lesson plans that we've included in our resource guide that you can adapt, right, to our local context, or again, use it to help your students understand that boarding schools were not just a local phenomena, but they happened all over the United States. We just really appreciate the way this resource, again, portrays Native peoples with agency, respect, and authenticity, and makes connections to some topics that not all the other resources do, like the connection between boarding schools and pandemics, and recognizing that some of the trauma from the COVID-19 pandemic may have brought up historical trauma in communities from the massive loss of life due to diseases that happened at the beginning of contact and in the boarding schools. So we really encourage you to check out this resource as well. And so I think we're going to move into now looking at how we can connect these topics to our Arizona standards, recognizing that that's what drives our instruction here in the state of Arizona.
Fantastic. So we've showed you a couple of lessons with the Project Zero thinking circle viewpoints, as well as the observe, reflect, and question kind of going forward. So just in the chat, I'd like for you to think with those 2 lessons, like roughly how many standards do you think were included in those lessons? Each one, they're roughly about the same. So if you could just type a number into the chat of how many standards, social studies standards you think were covered by doing those types of lessons. Yep, grades 3 through 5, yes.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got 5, 15, 6, and 4. Enrique came yesterday, so he kind of knows a little bit more. 4. Fantastic. All right. So if you add up all the disciplinary skills and processes, civic standards, economic standards, history standards, geography standards, you are roughly covering about 14 to 15 of the standards that are in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade, depending upon, you know, what your focus is in there. And in addition, it's that idea too, that just by doing that observe, reflect, and question, or doing the visual, the circle viewpoints, because you're having kids write and speak, you're covering ELA standards as well. And those hit roughly about 8 to 9 ELA standards. So again, it's this idea that we don't want you to have, everything should be seamless and integrated, right? Where you aren't putting away the reading books and taking out your social studies. You're just talking about the units that you're covering, and you're bringing in some social studies, bringing in some science, bringing in some ELA into those lessons. And definitely you want to be doing it where you're as efficient as possible, and doing lessons where you focus on primary sources and ask good inquiry questions. You'll hit a lot of those sources over and over, standards over and over again, where your kids will get better at it. And you will also be using some of those ELA standards as well. So here we've gone through and I've just kind of covered some of the applicable standards with regards to third, fourth, and fifth grade. So we have our course considerations, which those are the content areas that you need to teach in a third grade class. And so these are just some that would apply to the Native American boarding schools. And again, there's the grade specific standards, right? So you've got the SP coded ones, which are all the inquiry where we're using chronological sequencing. You're asking kids to generate questions, right? You're developing questions about Arizona history. And then you get into some civic standards when you talk about how the federal government created these boarding schools. You're talking about the economics when the kids had to produce goods being there at the schools, describing the geography of where the schools are located, right? That we did that with our maps, and getting into some of the actual history standards. So you can see how we could get 14 standards just by doing one of these lessons. And then fourth grade is the same, right? We cover, it's really all about Indigenous peoples and the regions of the Americas. You do get into that European exploration and colonization. So you won't necessarily get into the content of the boarding schools, but definitely talking about that with regards to, you know, where maybe these schools are located. But again, covering a lot of just the inquiry standards, civic standards, economics, geography, and history of what our kids should be covering there. And then lastly, fifth grade, again, the content you're going to be covering ideas where you actually will get to the history of the boarding schools in a fifth grade class. And so you will cover some of that inquiry, civics, economics, geography, and history of why the federal government and some of that context of it happened and why they were created in there.
Oh, I just wanted to highlight quickly too. I think this is a great opportunity to do vertical planning, right, with your team and think about how you could introduce the concept of boarding schools in third grade in those standards that it aligns really well with in the context of Arizona. Then think about how maybe do you expand to that more national perspective of boarding schools in the upper grades. And even though we're talking about in fourth grade life prior to European exploration, right? That's a great way to talk about what was life like prior to the boarding schools and help students understand just how dramatic of a change was forced on those students through the boarding schools, and where you can really bring in Indigenous ways of knowing and being, right? And look at them more closely and deeply. And so, and speaking of looking at things more closely and deeply, we want to give you a chance to not only look at some of the resources, we just both dropped it at the same time, we are ready, but also talk to each other, those same groups you were in earlier, around what are you taking away from our time together today? How are you going to apply what you've learned to your instructional design? What connections are you making to your specific context and classroom? Thinking about the grade level that you teach, but also thinking about the community that you serve. What is their relationship to this topic like, and how are you going to take that into consideration as you plan lessons? Because I think the point earlier around students who may have really, really personal connections to this topic is very important to consider, and that's part of being trauma informed and culturally responsive, right? So we're going to send you into those same rooms. And I will be sharing my screen, the breakout screen, onto the screen, so that way you have these discussion prompts. But we're asking that you just record some of your takeaways on the slide deck that we've included. So if you're in breakout room 1, you'll go to slide 1. If you're in breakout room 2, you'll go to slide 2. And they don't need to be full sentences. They can be bullet points, lists, really just asking that you jot down what you're taking away. And so we'll take about 7 minutes, I want to say, so that we can come back and have time to really close in some reflections and let you know next steps for continuing learning together.
Perfect. I'm going to open the rooms. And there we go.
And I see we have someone who may.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, so thank you everyone for taking the time to really reflect on everything we talked about today and starting to think about how you're going to incorporate this into your classroom. We're going to move in the last few minutes just to our closing thoughts, and for the sake of time, we'll move right into our survey and attendance. We do have a survey that we're asking you to complete just so that we can evaluate how effective our professional learning was. We think this is a really critical topic to provide professional learning on, and we want to make sure that we're meeting your needs. So if you could please take a few moments to fill out that survey, and then I will let Linda speak to our community of practice.
Thank you. So we have only got a few minutes left, but one thing that Helen and I wanted to again model with Indigenous ways of knowing and being was to create a community of practice for you. And so look to both of our newsletters, and you will also find it on the ADE calendar. We're going to create a community of elementary educators that anyone can come together. You don't have to have attended the trainings, but just once a quarter, have everybody touch base, share how they've been able to integrate some of these Indigenous perspectives in Native American boarding schools into your already existing curriculum. And then also share maybe some of the challenges that you've had, some barriers, be able to problem solve and work together as a community to find the best ways in which we can do this and help both our Indigenous students, but to also share these multiple perspectives and get the story out and relate it to Indigenous peoples today from a position of agency and strength going forward. So be mindful to look for that, because we would like to invite you and invite any of your colleagues to come and join us as we do this throughout the next school year. It will be once a quarter. So we'll have one for elementary in first, second, and third quarters. And then also for your attendance, we ask that you please put your name into the chat, your first and last name into the chat, and that will be a way in which that I can double check the attendance that you came today. You will need to wait until you get an email from me in a couple of days that your attendance will be marked complete. And with that, I will also include then a PDF copy of this and the chat as well. So that way you have all of the resources available to you, as well as you also have access to the Wakelet that we put into the chat earlier, as well with our resources. And so those will all be also included in the email if you happen to not get them today. And so with that, I'm going to say thank you so much for coming, and I appreciate it. Here's all of our contact information. I'm gonna let Helen say goodbye and Professor Pino say goodbye before we end the recording.
Yes, I just want to say, Wopila, thank you, and Lakota, really appreciate you all taking the time as educators to not only learn about this topic, but think critically about how you can incorporate it into your instruction. We're very grateful and appreciative of you spending your time with us today. Manny, is there anything you'd like to share in closing?
Tawa e haupahana. Yes, thank you, and Akama. And I learned a lot today. You know, as I shared with my chat room, you know, I'm not used to teaching 3rd to 5th graders, you know, but I really learned a lot, especially the standards that were shared on the slide between each grade group. That was interesting for me to read. And thank you for the worthwhile session organized by Linda and Helen. As always, good resources. Thank you. Tawa e.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a fantastic, wonderful rest of your summer. Let's see.